or a vermin or something. So the thing I wanted to talk about real quick is I've been thinking for a long time about a person named SLAVOJ ZIZEK. SLAVOJ ZIZEK, spelled SLAVOJ
Yeah.
space ZIZEK. He is a Slovenian, Slovenian.
I think people say
Slovian. He's a Slovian
I don't know.
academic who's popular for he has a bunch of published stuff. He's sort of what they call in academia a post-structuralist. Structuralism was a sort of a post-Marxist school of thought. It contributed to ideas you hear nowadays of structural oppression, structural racism. You have an argument basically that structural elements force actions less, not so much the plans and actions of individuals. So maybe a structuralism versus what you might call an instrumentalism or a conspiracy mindset. You often see it called. So Zizek started out translating and reinterpreting the works of postmodern academics, and by the early 2000s he released a series of popular amongst a certain crowd films of what seemed to be film criticism. And this is where it all sort of popped in my head. And I'm not crazed, but it may sound a little bit too convenient, too narrative. And I don't think it's accidental, because like Zizek, I am a post-Marxist structuralist theorist, and like the truest academics, I lived in the woods and was taught by wolves. I grew up in a cave, and I sucked milk from a sow's teat, and that gave me transcendental abilities to make connections. And what I wanted to talk about is he applies specifically. So there's he applies specifically the methodology and the traditions of psychoanalysis, which is sort of pioneered by Austrian and German theorists and practitioners like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. And he applies psychoanalysis, which is a one-on-one process, a conversational process, an exploratory process, and in some ways a storytelling process where you communicate with an individual. And he has tried to apply that to films, which are a commercial product made by a group, made by usually a corporate entity, some sort of filmmaking endeavor. There is a director, but the director is not a painter. He is a labor director for a collaborative effort.
Yeah.
His artistic direction is translated to, it has a lot to do with it, but you cannot look at the collaborative actions of a group paid, financed by a complicated studio system with all of these people coming from all these different unions, and you have all of these different laws regulating what you can print and the movies you can make that can still be profitable.
So to be more precise, when he analyzes these films, he's not necessarily psychoanalyzing the collective. He's psychoanalyzing the characters created through this collective, right? He is looking primarily at the characters in the films.
Yeah, and the plot elements.
Okay,
I
see.
So psychoanalysis is already not a scientific process. And this is going further,
right,
which is that psychoanalysis in some ways helps you explain the actions of a person in a narrative sense. And this is taking that narrative explanation and trying to reverse engineer it into ideological considerations that apply to actual humans. So he's taking characters made by a production company, and he's trying to equate them to humans or political actors, or even at best, he's trying to equate them to characters in a novel, which they're not, because a screenplay is almost always edited. Things will be added to it, subtracted to it. Ultimately, the director and the cinematographer have so much to do with what makes it to the viewer. And so I think that this is, I don't really get into intent that much. People say this is intentional, this is unintentional. If I say it, it's usually by accident, and it's just because I'm being sloppy. I'm just going to say what I think he's doing. What he's helping to do is redefine the actions of a group as the actions of one single person. Blur the line between what is a corporation and what is a person. It's sort of a communist idea, but in the worst way, because instead of your community, it is your corporate community, which is decided by the wants of the very few rich people.
Right.
Direct capital.
That's how I feel. Like when people say the black community or the gay community or any sort of thing, like no community really exists of these people outside of the people's heads.
We don't have Grange halls or Soviets or meeting houses. We don't have this. Communities aren't making their voices. Like there's a ton of research that the bulk of people don't get their policies passed.
It's an idea that only somebody who is used to viewing people as images and nothing more, like people who manage others, basically. A black person is the group of black people that you idealize.
Everything's a stereotype, or it's a tool with a function that can be plugged or played into different parts of the machine. So I'm amazed I haven't fallen apart, and I've maintained my train of thought, because this is like 8 things, and I can usually remember about 3. So the middle thing I want to go into before my connection is just the idea of sophistry. Sophistry is sort of a historical, philosophical idea, and it's sort of just it's like a slur word against teachers that philosophers used. And so teachers were using some of the products of philosophy, but not really understanding the holistic nature. They were specializing, and then they were mercenaries, basically. So they were teaching rich people. And so Socrates got pissed off at sophists because they were not concerned with the truth. They were just concerned with using arguments that philosophers had generated, philosophers being people concerned with the truth. Yeah. So the duality you're supposed to...
And even after
Socrates, they still existed, and people still called people sophists. They still do today.
Yeah, and their goal wasn't necessarily always to use. It was to.
Did you almost say rhetoric? Because rhetoric was really huge for sophists.
Right.
So it's teaching people to use.
I'm trying to put together. Yeah.
Yeah,
they're concerned with teaching somebody something specific. They're concerned with imparting somebody with a specific knowledge instead of what a philosopher's duty is to spark somebody else's, as Plato would say, or something.
Teach them how to continue to think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think there's always going to be overlap. This is always going to be a factional decision, who's a sophist and who's a philosopher. But this is sort of a basic concept in philosophy. And what you see people who often get identified as sophists doing is quickly using a small set of logical fallacies in rapid succession in a way that's very hard for our brains to track. And so what they'll do is they will mistake the actions of one person in a group for the actions of everyone. And that's stereotyping.
Yeah.
They will mistake the actions of vice versa. So they'll mix up the group responsibility. They'll say that this one person, so let's say Jeff Gordon cheated in a race. You're saying I hate NASCAR drivers, they're dirty cheaters. And so you're saying every single NASCAR driver is a dirty cheater. And so you do this really quickly, and you can do it intuitively, because sophists are more concerned with the rhythm of the argument and winning the argument through rhetoric and getting what they're trying to get, which is usually some sort of prestige, political power, wealth, whatever, just sort of trying to impress you maybe. So what impresses me is that Zizek is presented as a philosopher, but he is the king of the sophists. He is the most powerful modern academic sophist, and probably the greatest sophist of all time. If you're just talking about human souls that have been deluded by his sophistry. And so if that seems barbed, if you love Zizek.
Plus, you can love him and still like his job is to
sure.
tell jokes and to tell stories
Yeah.
and stuff. Yeah,
I'm sure
I listen to him all the time because he's plenty entertaining. You know.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of there were a lot of useful idiots that were like wicked.
I mean, it's the same thing as Alex Jones. You can learn stuff from Alex Jones, and maybe it's not true, but
and he has like a horrible agenda. And it's in the same way. He's a cog. He's he sort of sometimes just screams it into the air. It's like, this is not my. I have to, and it's because there's so many pressures pushing him to keep doing the same thing. Because if he gave up his income base, he would get crushed by lawsuits.
Yeah,
and he has to push and generate more lawsuits to maintain his income base. So, getting back to Zizek and this idea of mixing up the works of a film production company and the works of an individual artist, this, I think, relates directly to the central deception, the central destructive mechanism, the central mechanism of wealth transfer from the rich to the poor, which is, in the immortal words of Mitt Romney, corporations are people, my friend. Zizek is making this fundamental cultural academic argument to try to push people into blurring the lines mentally between what a group does and what an individual does. And there's already so many things doing this to you online. So a Twitter account might be an individual, or it might be a whole room of people. It might be 500 people. It might be 3. It might be 1. And so there's all sorts of pressures doing this already, so you can forgive him for doing it. But what this has the effect of trying to apply psychoanalysis, which is not designed at all to deal with the works of production companies, with films. It's just a complete non sequitur. It's trying to apply the fundamentals of carpentry to graphical design. You're going to get a lot of flat, a lot of square. You're going to get a lot of right angles. And so it will only take you so far. You can make something that looks like a complex, interesting picture.
Was there ever a tradition of psychoanalyzing like novels and things like that?
Yes, that's what critical theory did before it got to films.
Is that what that's like the hermeneutics? Is that what that is?
I don't know. I don't know if I've heard. So I think that critical theory basically came from criticism, and the way I look at it, which is unfair, sloppy, categorical, fallacious. The way I look at it is that people used to make fun of critics for not being able to do the art, whereas actually a lot of critics were accomplished artists. This did change, but people would say, if you can't succeed as an artist, become a critic. Now I think, because the critical theorists they're not interested in any of the workings of politics or any of how this stuff actually works, any of the truth claims about it. So if you can't even be a critic, be a critical theorist. You have the appearance of being a critic. You have the appearance of applying criticism, but it is a appropriation of the word critical
ideology,
to be its opposite, basically, to knock things down but have no counter thesis, to provide a key thesis with no counter thesis, which always just leads you into a web. Like from Go, there's a position you can find yourself in, and you just, if you keep following it, you just lose all your pieces. Wow, that web lost me. That was a bad idea. But the thing that strikes me is it is incredibly convenient for the ways that public propaganda has also like advertising and stuff sort of tries to make people think. It tries popular music encourages you to live in the moment and to ignore long-term planning and make yourself more susceptible to consumerism in the market. And what I find so interesting about Zizek is that he has combined consumerism, this commercial appeal, because he's talking about films. People don't read anymore, so now he's talking about films. So he has this commercial value, this corporate value, and this state value. And they sort of merge to where he is sort of this ultimate useful idiot sophist. And I mean, I think there's probably like a couple things. Well, Well, I guess so. Just going back to, I think that there is. Well, I think at its most basic level, the idea that there is a separation, a clear separation between the works of an academic and the works of a popular writer. There is no clear separation. The separation has to be in quality. And so what can happen is academics can make work that has the appearance of having the quality of academic work, but it uses jargon and terminology to sort of confound people and provide the appearance of sophistication, which a lot like the word sophist we were talking about before. And maybe it is sophistication if it's just sophistry. But yeah, he has some interesting things to say, sort of. But I don't think. I think the most interesting things he has to say are honestly when he just like rips. A lot of times he just rips on his fans because he obviously hates his fans.
Yeah.
Because I don't think he takes it. People call themselves philosophers as a marketing tool.
Yeah.
And if you are buying into these central ideas of philosophy, I don't even know why you'd publish in philosophy. That's nuts. I mean, it's wackadoo, and the philosophers who people read the most and most respected weren't chairs of philosophy at universities. So it's very pretentious. It's like saying you can make folk music when folk music is music that survives through generations, and you're saying you're making folk music, but generations haven't passed yet, so you have no way of knowing it's folk music. In the same way, you have no way of knowing that your essays are philosophy, and so you should use clear language and talk specifically about something. And if you're using a methodology, you have to use a carefully vetted methodology, which in the social sciences are very few that aren't statistically based. I think that's the thing, is you quickly get bogged down. Your research becomes less glamorous, less interesting to people because you're not just talking about films. And so he just found a way to slot himself into the commercial market. And the ideas that he's pushing forth, I think, are the same ones that treat a corporation as a person, that push responsibility between a we and an I, which is ultimately authoritarian, because the king was acting on behalf of everybody. He had the divine right of kings, and that's what. And so when in some ways he is the whole body of the people. Yeah. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, actually, the front drawing is a whole bunch of people made up into the body of the monarch. And I think that is what his idea is sort of explicitly or implicitly designed to do, is sort of cut down these ideas of individuation. He's using the products of the Enlightenment and philosophy, but I think fundamentally his drive is anti-liberal, anti-Enlightenment. I think he's just trying to push us back towards that monarchy by helping to ease us in to this world where a corporation is a person. I mean, eventually they can just make a robot or an animation and just start telling people that the corporation is a person. But I think it's a huge fundamental part of our problem with our laws that we allow these liability shifts through corporation laws, which fundamentally, for decades, because of judicial precedent, have defined corporations in some aspects as people. So when Mitt Romney was saying corporations are people, my friend, that's what he was talking about. In case law, they are. But everybody at the time said that's ridiculous. Obviously, corporations aren't people. But I think people like SLAVOJ ZIZEK are working to help make corporations people. So in the beginning of Animal Farm, everybody agrees that the animals, except for the birds, have to walk on all fours, and they don't wear clothes, and they don't drink alcohol. But as the pigs manipulate power through the novel, they start drinking alcohol, and at the end of the novel, they're wearing clothes and they're walking upright.
Yeah.
In a grotesque mockery of man. And in the same way, I think that people like Zizek are useful tools by an establishment to sort of mow down the inefficiency that self-rule, democracy, education, and free thinking represent to people in positions of power.
Yeah, and I guess it's he contributes to this sort of general this effect isn't particular to him. Like, this is the effect of most media.
I think he's just one of the most visible of a class of academics.
Right.
And then the media take their cues from academics.
It's like LeBron James. I saw this on InfoWars the other night. The interview with LeBron James, telling the reporter that black people are terrified. We are terrified. Black women, men, children, because we don't know when the cop gets out of the door, like how he left the house. And he's LeBron James,
right? Like, clearly he can't be speaking from his present experience,
right? Maybe
in the past, but now he has more than a security detail,
right? Exactly.
So if he's terrified, it might have more to do with him being worried about
Well, he's he's equating himself just because of what he looks like with the group.
Yes.
Which is the point of all of this, is to have yourself be included in this subjectivity, I guess. You know?
Yeah, and we talked about this a little bit before, and I think what's important about the idea, we used to take it completely for granted, and no one would ever make it explicit because it was so, individualism was so strong in almost all American media. And the reason you want individualism is because it is the best counter to tribalism. And what tribalism does is it allows racist ideologies, bigoted ideologies, any sort of class or group-based discriminatory ideology, the worst types of nationalism, like you saw in Europe in the beginning half of the 20th century. Those things, that comes from the destruction of the individual to serve the needs of the group, but the needs of the group are always just less individuals.
Right.
And
it'll always it always seems like it's your interest because you're confusing your interest with somebody else's.
Yes.
Like you.
Right, and so
that's why you do your job in like the horribly exploitative way, or you go to school for this future that you aren't even sure exists.
Yes,
because it's the best thing to do for you, and not because it's good for whoever for you to take out $50,000 worth of loans and everything.
Yeah, and even just for a lot of kids probably like don't need to go to a regimented elementary school. But then some parents are forced into wage labor, so they need essentially childcare. And so instead of us honestly broaching that problem, now we've been forced to, instead of us honestly dealing with that, we've sort of cloaked it in the veil of education. And because of that, there is just this there's a breakdown in education because it is a daycare, and it becomes maximized for that. And I think that's very important for helping people think that they are. I think education
that they are dependent on people supervising them.
Yeah, and other people's judgment, and that they will be graded, and that there's. A lot of educational reformers really don't like the idea of number grades until a certain age, when the children can understand mathematically what the grade represents. And when I was going through school, they didn't use number grades until middle school. So there were definitely a lot of that stuff was taken on board. Interestingly, a lot of those educational ideas are originally from Austrian thinkers, sort of contemporaneous with Sigmund Freud, because Austria was the center of the academic world until World War I and II. Well, cool. I think that's good. I think that's all my SLAVOJ ZIZEK.
Okay.
I've got this dog. Ugh. We'll see how this looks. I didn't really frame the shot right, but that's okay.
Oh yeah.
That's all right.